Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about pure monopoly. I'm not gonna make this video long because I believe that the videos that I already recorded separately on this chapter are more beneficial for you to watch even than this one. So make sure that you check the videos that I posted already on D12 for this chapter. So in the previous chapter, if you remember, we talked about 4 different markets in microeconomics. We talked about perfect competition and the profit maximization in that market in the previous chapter. In this chapter, we're going to talk about pure monopoly and how basically the profit maximization happens in this market. If you remember, in perfect competition in chapter 10, we talked about 2 different approaches for profit maximization: total revenue and total cost. That was the first approach. And the second one was marginal revenue and marginal cost. So marginal revenue and marginal cost approach is actually common between perfect competition and also pure monopoly. So we're going to again use that methodology here for profit maximization. These are some of the important characteristics of pure monopoly that we also had in chapter 10, at the beginning of chapter 10. For instance, we only have 1, sometimes 2 producers in a pure monopoly. The products that we have basically are not identical. There's no close substitutes for the products we see in perfect monopoly or pure monopoly. Unlike perfect competition, our monopolist can control the price 100%. So the basically sellers in perfect competition in chapter 10, they were all price takers. That's why we never talked about how basically businesses choose the price, because the price was given. But in this market, in pure monopoly, since a single producer can control the price, they are basically, the producers basically are price makers. So that's a big difference between perfect competition and pure monopoly. And you will see in this chapter that we are actually going to find the price. What is the perfect price for pure monopoly to maximize the profit? Something that we did not look into in chapter 10. And getting into this market is super duper difficult, almost impossible. Again, unlike perfect competition. So perfect competition and pure monopoly are kind of the opposite of each other in many aspects. So you can again go back to chapter 10 and kind of compare the characteristics of these two. If you want to put microeconomic markets on a spectrum, pure competition is on one side, in one extreme, and then we have pure monopoly on the other end of this spectrum. So you can tell that they're exactly the opposite of each other, okay? And these are some of the examples of monopoly. The important thing that you need to know about pure monopoly, as I also mentioned it in chapter 10, is that the firms in pure monopoly are either government owned or government regulated. That's one of the main reasons that we do not really see many firms in pure monopoly. So the government tries actually to control the market and doesn't allow many firms actually get into the market. So local utilities, like gas, electricity companies, they are all in pure monopoly. Water companies, things like that. We talked about the characteristics of monopoly probably more in chapter 10. So I would definitely recommend you guys to go back and check out the table we had at the beginning of chapter 10. Let's quickly talk about the reasons that we do not see many firms and getting into this market, and why getting into this market is impossible. One of the reasons is because of the economies of scale that we also had in chapter 9. If you remember, we talked about the long run average total cost at the end of chapter 9. And we talked about different characteristics of the long run ATC. One of them was economies of scale, and it was the place on the long run average total cost where the company is producing actually more output, but the cost per unit of output is going down. Monopolies only operate at the economies of scale part of the long run average total cost, and that's a huge benefit for them. It means that they are producing more and more, but their cost per unit of output actually is just going down. The average cost is just going down. This is something that many businesses want to see, but they are not successful to achieve it. If you remember, we talked about constant return to scale and diseconomies of scale. So definitely review that part of chapter 9 if you do not remember what I mean by economies of scale. So in economies of scale part, basically, let's say we are increasing the input by or our resources, let's say by 1%, but then the output actually is going to go up by more than 1%. So the growth of your output is pretty significant, and the average cost actually is going down. So it's a huge thing for businesses, right? So one of the advantages that pure monopoly actually has compared to other markets or our monopolies as our producers or business owner in this market basically have is this economies of scale, okay? And since the firms are government regulated or government owned, so we're also dealing with patent licenses, so again, make it difficult for other firms and businesses to get into the market and to use basically the products that are produced in this market. That's why we have also unique product. The monopolies in this market, again, because of the power that they have, they can actually own resources. So no problem. That's another advantage for them. They can own the resources, factors of production that we also discussed in chapter 1. And also think about local utilities. Okay, let's say we're talking about an electricity company. So starting and opening an electricity company has a huge initial cost, right? So basically firms should pay trillions of dollars to start the business, and then they have to have a huge basically share in the market to make the business profitable, right? So not everyone has this amount of money to start such a business. Again, that's probably because of the type of the companies that we see in pure monopoly, government owned and government regulated. So starting the business in pure monopoly is basically very, very expensive. So not everybody can get into the market because of that reason, okay? I'm skipping this part because this is exactly what I just talked about the economies of scale. If you remember now let's talk about profit maximization. So far I just talked about the characteristics of monopoly, why it's hard to get into this market. Now let's focus on the goal of this chapter, which is profit maximization, and let's see how it's going to happen. If you remember, in perfect competition markets, since our firms basically are our price takers, they didn't have any control over the price, right? That's very, very important. But we have price makers in this market in pure monopoly. Also, in perfect competition, we distinguish between the market demand and the demand for one firm. Demand for one firm in perfect competition was perfectly elastic. It was horizontal, and the market demand was downward slope, just like chapter 3. In this chapter, in pure monopoly, there is no difference between the demand for one firm and the demand for market. And the reason for that is that we only have one firm, and that firm basically owns the entire market, right? So there's no difference between a market demand and one firm's demand because the firm is the entire market. And we have a typical shape for demand in this market. We have a downward slope demand, okay? If you remember, we had a very, very similar table like this in also chapter 10. You can compare it with chapter 10. If you remember, the price in perfect competition was fixed, again, because the firms are all price takers. And in this example, if I recall, the price was $2 in that market. Here, however, the price is changing. So for the test, for the assignments, even if you don't, even if the question doesn't tell you which market we're talking about, if you have such a table and when you see that the price is changing, you can definitely say that for sure that we're talking about pure monopoly. If, however, the price is fixed, then we're talking about pure competition, because in the pure competition, the price is given, right? If you also remember in chapter 10, the price was equal to marginal revenue was equal to average revenue in perfect competition. We do not have such a thing in pure monopoly, okay? The price is not fixed. As you can see, the price is changing. As a result, definitely our total revenue is going to go up because both the quantity and the price are going up. Remember, total revenue is price times quantity. We also learned in the previous chapter that how we can calculate marginal revenue. Marginal revenue was the change in total revenue divided by change in quantity. Again, you can have all the formulas for the test, for the assignment, no problem. Just make sure you know how to use them. And as you can see here, the marginal revenue is no longer fixed, is no longer equal to price. And in fact, the marginal revenue decreases as we produce more and more. And if you compare the marginal revenue with price, you can see that the marginal revenue is always smaller than price. Okay, so that's another important fact about pure monopoly. So price is not fixed, marginal revenue is not fixed. Marginal revenue, in fact, is always less than price and decreases as we produce more and more. Remember that the marginal revenue is extra revenue when we produce one more unit of output. If you put demand and marginal revenue together, as I said, demand is downward the slope. And again, this is the market demand and also one firm's demand because they are exactly the same. And also our marginal revenue is downward slope. And again, you can draw this graph, just put your quantity on the X and put the price or marginal revenue on the Y, and then just draw the entire thing. And you will see that they are both downward slope, demand and marginal revenue. They were both horizontal in chapter 10. So again, compare this graph with what we had in chapter 10. Then you can probably understand even both chapters, I think, better if you compare them with each other. And also, marginal revenue is steeper than demand here. They're both downward slope, but it is steeper, okay? Because the price is bigger than marginal revenue. In perfect competition, when we talked about profit maximization, as I mentioned earlier, we were not looking for the price. The price was given. We were just looking for the optimal quantity. We wanted to make sure that we are picking the optimal quantity because we wanted to achieve the maximum profit, right? And we were able to find that optimal quantity by using the total revenue, total cost approach or marginal revenue, marginal cost approach, right? Here in pure monopoly, however, we should look for both price and quantity because the firm we have in pure monopoly is price maker. So we have to make sure that our monopoly is picking up the appropriate price, the optimal price, as well as the optimal quantity. You will see that finding the optimal quantity is very similar to chapter 10, but let's now focus on price. Okay, let's see how monopolies can find the optimal price. And it kind of goes back to what we had in previous chapters, okay? Whenever we had a downward slope and a linear demand from chapter 6, you probably remember that the price elasticity of demand changes along the linear demand when the demand curve is a straight line, okay? The price elasticity of demand was greater than 1 at the higher price level. It was equal to 1 when we were kind of in the middle of our linear demand. So the demand was unit elastic. And at the lower price level, the price elasticity of demand was less than 1, meaning that our demand is inelastic. The key for our monopoly is to pick the price. And one of the benefits actually that our pure monopolies have is that they always pick the price at the elastic part of the demand. They never ever choose a price in the inelastic region of the demand or even unit elastic part of the demand curve, okay? And that can guarantee positive profit for them. Why? If you remember from, again, chapter 6, that we talked about total revenue, right? If the demand is elastic, there was an inverse relationship between price and total revenue, right? So that's a huge benefit for pure monopoly. If they pick their price at the elastic part of their demand, they have this power of reducing the price and still making profit, still making total revenue. They can reduce the price. Let's say they have a new competitor in the market. They can kick out this new firm easily in the market by just reducing the price, because they pick their price at the elastic part of their demand. So they are reducing the price, but their total revenue is just going up. And remember, they are operating at the economies of scale part of the total cost, average total cost. So two things are happening. They are able to reduce the price, increase their total revenue, and their cost per unit of output is going down. So they can always have the profit, right? So they're not really worried about the profit at all, okay? So that is how they can pick their price. At the same time, let's talk about quantity, which is very similar to chapter 10. So pure monopoly can pick the optimal quantity that can guarantee the maximum profit. How? Using the same approach we had in chapter 10, marginal revenue, marginal cost analysis, which was nothing but the equality between marginal revenue and marginal cost. So whenever marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's where the quantity for monopolies is optimal, and that is the quantity that guaranteed the maximum profit. So these are the steps that pure monopolies should take to maximize the profit. We also had a similar one in chapter 10. You can check it out. So first, they can pick the price by finding the marginal revenue, marginal cost. Whenever they are equal, the quantity is optimal. The price is coming from the elastic part of their linear downward slope demand. Then the next step for us is to calculate the profit. Profit is total revenue minus total cost. So they should calculate TR, total revenue, which is price times quantity, total cost, which is the sum of total fixed cost and total average cost. Or you can multiply the average average total cost by quantity to get your total cost, right? So that is your profit. The profit in monopoly is always, always, always positive. If you remember from chapter 10, we talked about those times that the firm is operating, but there's no profit, right? Especially if we're talking about the lower amount of output when we just started the business in the short run, and this is by the way is also short run. So the business basically is not profitable. Remember, especially when we were talking about the area that is right before the first break-even point. Remember. So, and we also discussed about shutdown case, right? When business is not profitable, so it could be before the first break-even point, sometimes it's after the second break-even point. So business is not profitable. That's why we talked about shutdown case and finding out if the business should still operate with the optimal amount of output or take a little break. Remember, so definitely review shutdown case if you don't know what I'm talking about here. We are not worried about shutdown case at all in pure monopoly because of this graph that I also explained it separately in another video. So we have a downward slope demand, marginal revenue is also downward slope. They are not horizontal anymore because of the characteristics of this market. We have our U-shaped marginal cost that we learned about it in chapter 9. The intersection of marginal revenue, marginal cost is the area that is the point that we can find our optimal quantity, right? So let's go down, all the way down. Oops. to our quantity axis. So in this example, the 5 units of output is the optimal quantity. So you come all the way up from your quantity to your demand to find that elastic part of your demand curve. Then you can find your optimal price. In this example, the optimal price is $125, okay? So if you multiply the price by quantity, you can get your total revenue. But since I want to show you the price, so we need to also add the average total cost, and our average total cost, which let's say in this example is 100 when we produce the 5 units of output. If you multiply the average total cost by quantity, then you can get your total cost. So your total cost in this example is 100 times 5, which is $500. Your total revenue, however, was 125 times 5, which is 125 times 5, which is 625. So the profit is 625 minus 500, which is 125. The 125 is the economic profit, which is the difference between TR and TC. The profit in monopoly market is always positive. So we are not worried about shutdown case. We are not worried about not making profit at some point in the short run. We always have positive profit. So we're not going to talk about shutdown case like perfect competition market. Okay, so the profit is always positive. And again, it's because of the characteristics we have in pure monopoly. So definitely make sure to watch the other videos that I posted on D2L, and I hope that you find this video helpful. Till next time.